This course is in two parts. The first day is primarily about ontology as it used to be known, ontology as a branch of philosophy. And then day two is about what ontology will be in our futures, namely no longer a branch of philosophy. And so part of today will be to demonstrate, first of all, what ontology has learned from philosophy, why it was born within philosophy, and also to indicate the steps which are being taken in order to create ontology as an independent discipline. So the final lecture today is called Ontologists Leaving the Mothership of Philosophy. Now, I could, in fact, when it comes to the history of ontology within philosophy, confine myself to this one single slide. I'm very much a believer that philosophy started to go downhill when the Aristotelian era came to an end. Aristotle invented ontology in a way which we can still recognize today as a study of the ways in which the universe is organized into types or kinds or universals or categories. Categories are basically the highest level universals. All the other universals are organized hierarchically beneath these top-level categories. And we'll talk about the top-level categories in the course of this presentation. And for Aristotle, these categories and these universals are intelligible, which means that we can formulate definitions of them which we can understand. Now, this idea was taken over by various important philosophers over the next couple of thousand years who thought that this was perennial philosophy, that the problems of philosophy had been solved. And moreover, they saw this perennial philosophy as being omnicompetent in the sense that it pertained to all domains. All domains of reality can be understood by understanding the universals which obtain within those domains. Universals like man or organism or birth or death or city or poem and so on. And gradually the medievals also developed a common controlled vocabulary for talking about these universals and about the structure of reality, which was a sort of standardized Latin, which was used in all intellectual circles across the entire civilized universe. Now, this common control vocabulary idea will become important later on, as you will see. Then things started to go downhill. I'm not saying that Descartes was the only person to blame. I think Galileo, too, played an important role in divorcing ontology from this study of the intelligible structure of the universe. Descartes initiated a movement which, first of all, placed epistemology at the center of philosophy, rather than ontology or metaphysics, as it was called, until around 1651. Descartes also created a problem by emphasizing the distinctions, the heterogeneity between mental and physical substances, which had not been a problem for Aristotle. Descartes, having set this epistemological train into motion, the dominance of epistemology became ever greater through the work of Kant, who actually propounded a view according to which we can't know what reality in itself is like in any case. We can only know what we might think of as a quasi-fictional domain of experience, which we ourselves create by imposing categories on reality, rather than, as in the case of Aristotle, understanding the intelligible structures of the universe as they are in themselves. Aristotle was a philosopher who believed that we could know what reality is like. From Kant onwards, and it's still alive today, rose instead what we might think of as a philosophy of suspicion. We must always be suspicious of anybody who claims to know what reality is like. And this philosophy of suspicion has overwhelmed certain circles of philosophy in the 20th century, and not only in Paris. Now, Brentano was an Austrian philosopher who tried to put the Aristotelian train back on the rails. His first work has a dedication in which he describes himself as being literally Aristotle's favorite son. Just think about that. Brentano thought that the methods of philosophy and science are one and the same. There is no divorce between philosophy and science. His major work was called Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint, and it is in fact both a work of philosophy and a work of psychology, because for Brentano, the same methods apply in both cases. Brentano saw Aristotle as being associated with a wonderment at the idea that we can understand reality. Now, for the medievals, it was obvious that we can understand reality. Shoes and mothers and milk actually exist, ladies and gentlemen. But in the period following Kant, it was astonishing, the proposal that we could understand reality. So Brentano had to express this astonishment. Now, Brentano's favorite son, or anyway, the most important philosopher who was influenced by Brentano, was another Austrian philosopher who, however, lived most of his career in Germany. Was Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology. And he was also the inventor of the discipline of formal ontology. And that invention of formal ontology will become clear. The importance of it will become clear in the next lecture. One of the features of Aristotelianism is that the common sense reality that we experience in our ordinary everyday actions and perceptions is not radically distinct from the reality that we understand through science. Galileo was the person who established this radical distinction. Husserl thought that by claiming that this radical distinction existed, and by misunderstanding the nature of the link between common sense experience and the reality revealed by science, we make mistakes. Basically, we devalue common sense experience, again, as somehow fictional or as somehow suspicious, because the only true reality is the reality experienced when we do scientific experiments. Husserl tried to bring those two realms together once again. He did a lot of other things, but these are the two things which are important for our purposes. One, he invented formal ontology as a formal discipline distinct from logic. And the other was to emphasize that there is a problem if you deny the reality that is presented in ordinary experience. Now, one of Brentano's works, which I translated into English, is called The Four Phases of Philosophy. And the idea is that there are these four phases which repeat in cycles through the whole history of philosophy. So we start with a phase of rapid progress. And in general, you can see this phase as being the phase where people rediscover Aristotle. So things get good again when people go back to Aristotle. And then there is a phase which is dominated by practical interest when people try and apply these discoveries. And then there is a phase of skepticism. And this phase, that's Descartes. And this phase of skepticism reaches a low point where you have mysticism, because you don't believe that you can know anything anymore. And so whatever you claim really is just as valid as anything else. So in the first cycle, we have the discovery of reality and the discovery of the possibility of understanding reality, the discovery of science, which ends with Aristotle, Plato, starts with the pre-Socratics. And then we have what Brentano describes as the stage, the phase of practical attention, which is Stoicism and Epicureanism. And then you have Pyrrhonian and eclectic skeptics. And then you have Neo-Pythagorean and Neo-Platonist mystical nonsense. And then Aquinas and the medieval scholastics rediscover Aristotle. So things are on the up again. There is, in the 14th century, an absolutely amazing golden age of philosophy. And but then, as Brentano sees it, anyway, the high point of this golden age is reached by Scotism, but Scotism is too much focused on practical applications and gives rise to the skepticism of nominalism and Occam. So people no longer believe in universals, and they no longer believe that we can understand universals. And then again, you have a period of mystical nonsense where people defend contradiction. And then the third cycle, again, is here it's the rediscovery of science, the possibility of empirical knowledge about reality with Locke and Bacon. And then you have the French, Leibniz with rationalism, who sort of attempt to systematize this, but bringing in elements which go beyond the empirical wonderment of being able to apprehend reality through scientific method. And then you have skepticism of Hume and Reid and other Scottish gentlemen, and then the Irish and the Germans come along and produce mystical nonsense. Now, something happened at the turn of the 20th century, which was, in addition to Brentano and Husserl, also the increasing importance of logic. Now, Wittgenstein was one of the most important figures in this phase of the history of ontology where logic was important. But we need to distinguish two Wittgensteins. The Wittgenstein who was the author of the Tractatus, and the later Wittgenstein, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, the idea of the Tractatus, the most important idea from our perspective, is the idea of picture theory of language. Language is a picture of reality. This is an important idea because it suggests, again, that ontology is possible, that we can describe reality, indeed by making a logical picture of reality. This is one idea which is at the heart of ontology, as I will describe it tomorrow. The problem was that for various reasons, Wittgenstein associated this picture with what we can think of as being reductionistic atomism. We can only have pictures of reality, Wittgenstein says, if we have pictures of the atomic structure of reality, where these atoms are absolute simples which we cannot further understand. This was a general tendency of 20th century logical philosophy. So the whole movement of philosophy associated with the Vienna Circle was sometimes called logical atomism. Now again, Aristotle, in fact, focused his philosophy on the sorts of things that we experience in the ordinary world, things like organisms, which are not atoms. For the followers of Wittgenstein, the author of the Tractatus, organisms don't really exist. We have somehow to logically reconstruct, talk about organisms talk about these absolute simple atoms. Now, this reductionist mode was not necessarily based on physical atoms. Sometimes it was based on atoms of sensation, sense data. But generally speaking, reductionistic atomism was a common theme within the logical philosophy of the first half of the 20th century, and indeed in much of the second half of the 20th century, when this kind of philosophy moved to the Anglo-Saxophone world. But in England, in the middle of the century, partly as a result of the later Wittgenstein's influence, there was yet another element which was brought in, which was focused not on ontology in the Aristotelian sense, not on physics, not on logic, but on language. Ordinary language philosophy became popular. In other words, for someone like J.L. Austin, who was one of the inventors of speech act theory, which we will come back to later, the way to solve philosophical problems is to study the workings of language. So you buy a big dictionary. And one of Wittgenstein's discoveries or proposals in his ordinary language phase is the idea that metaphysics is in fact a kind of sickness of language. It's what happens when ordinary language, which is already perfect as it stands, as it were, goes on holiday. So instead of saying, what time is it? It's 9:47. You say, you allow language to go on holiday and you say, what is time? And that kind of temptation to allow language to go on holiday seems to be characteristic of a certain type of human being. Teenagers, for instance, and philosophers. And Wittgenstein thought that we should try and cure this sickness by taking up gardening or... Now, Quine was one of the leading philosophers who took the ideas of the Vienna Circle, took the idea that philosophy should have logic at its heart, into the American philosophical scene. Now, Quine was interested in ontology, but he was not interested in ontology in the Aristotelian sense. He was not interested in describing or discovering what there is. Indeed, he thought that there was a very simple question to the answer, what is there? Namely, everything. He thought a much more interesting question was the question, what is a given science ontologically committed to? What does if you accept the propositions of general relativity theory, for instance, what kinds of entities are you presupposing to exist? So this is Quine's doctrine of ontological commitment. This is an interesting question. How do we know what a given scientific theory is committed to? And Quine's answer was that in order to know that, you have to formalize the scientific theory using logic. So logic becomes a tool for understanding the ontological commitments of a scientific theory. You can apply this same tool not just to a scientific theory, but also to a set of beliefs of a given culture, for instance. Catholicism or the beliefs of people in cultures where they believe in sun gods. They are committed ontologically to the existence of the sun god. That doesn't mean that the sun god exists. It means that a certain culture is committed ontologically to the sun god. You can apply it also to software. What is this particular database or this particular program committed to ontologically? And some of the ontological work that we'll be talking about tomorrow started out from this kind of Quinean question about ontological commitment being applied within the area of computation. Now, from around 1980, a new wave arose. And some would say that this was again a rediscovery of Aristotle, which means that it was a good time, in which something called analytical metaphysics became once again a dominant mode of doing philosophy. People in the Anglo-Saxon world were not ashamed of doing metaphysics. They didn't think that they could reduce the questions of metaphysics to questions of logic or language or science. They thought that metaphysics was indeed, in exactly the way that Aristotle thought, the most important part of philosophy. And we will be meeting some of the ideas of this analytical metaphysics in the next lecture. So we have philosophy comes to an end here, metaphysically speaking, and the question is what comes next. So this is the fourth cycle. We start off with Brentano. Everything is wonderful because people are once again expressing a wonderment that they can know the nature of reality. Husserl systematizes this. Heidegger, and then it becomes unknowable. But then there was also a fourth cycle within the analytical kingdom. So Frege, who I haven't mentioned so far, but Frege will be mentioned in due course, and Wittgenstein, the first Wittgenstein, and Bertrand Russell and the Vienna Circle, these constitute the first rising phase, not because of a rediscovery of Aristotle in this case, but because of the discovery of a really amazingly powerful new kind of logic, which was properly so impressive to the Vienna Circle that they thought that they could revolutionize philosophy. But then, inevitably, the skeptical period came along with Wittgenstein the second, and then we have also within the analytical world depths of mystical nonsense. Now, another dimension which is important here is that in the successive cycles of this four phases thing, the third phase, this should say phase here, is often marked by, this is correct, it should say cycle. From the third cycle onwards in the successive cycles that you've just seen, so this is the fourth analytical cycle, the first phase is often marked by the invention of new disciplines. So in the third phase, Locke and Bacon invented modern empirical natural science. They invented it as philosophers, but physics is now an independent science. It's no longer a part of natural philosophy as it was for 2,000 years. In the fourth cycle, thinkers like Brentano and also another German thinker by the name of Wundt, who we will be meeting shortly, invented psychology. Both Brentano and Wundt were professors of philosophy, but what they were doing was inventing the discipline which is nowadays called psychology, an experimental discipline with its own buildings and its own faculty and so forth. And Frege and Wittgenstein and Russell invented a new discipline of mathematical logic, which is now sometimes taught in mathematics institutes. There are, in fact, institutes of logic. Not very many of them, but there are some institutes of logic which treat logic as independent of both philosophy and mathematics. So this phenomenon of discovering or inventing new scientific disciplines is going to play an important role in what follows, because, as is probably clear by now, my claim is that ontology is being invented as we speak as a new independent discipline. So the fifth cycle, we're still in the positive phase, you'll be pleased to hear, constitutes or is constituted by a rediscovery of Aristotle and of the general Aristotelian way of doing things within the framework of analytical metaphysics, which means with the logical tools which we've been bequeathed by Quine, Russell, Wittgenstein, Frege, and so forth, but now gradually moving on to a phase of systematization where it becomes an independent discipline in its own right called ontology. Now, ontology, if it's going to be an independent discipline, needs a practical problem. And there are, in fact, a whole series of practical problems which ontology, in the modern sense, is attempting to solve. And I'll just give you one example of such a practical problem. Publishing, scientific publishing, has been for a long time a matter of printing text on paper. Very much like medieval monks, but you're using machines instead of human beings to actually write out these black and white marks on paper. Now, this period of scientific publishing is coming to an end. It will very soon be the case that there won't be printed scientific journals. Everything will be digital. But also, what is printed or what is published in this digital form will no longer be simple linear text. It will be, in the first phase, we can't anticipate what it will be in later phases, but in the first phase it will be text which is tagged. That is to say, the text becomes a jewel kind of artifact. On the one hand, it's something which can be read in the old-fashioned way by human beings using eyes. And on the other hand, the technical terms within the text will be clickable, and they'll be clickable because they're tagged using hyperlinks, and the hyperlinks will reveal various further information. Or the hyperlinks will themselves be linked together to create the digital equivalent of what you might think of as logical axioms. Now, there's one way of doing this is for each publisher or each editor, each journal will have their own tagging system. So I don't know how many journals of physics there are, but I'm sure that there are hundreds of journals of physics. If each journal used its own tagging system, then you could use these tags to do logical analysis of the content of journal articles or scientific empirical analysis of the content of journal articles only if you concentrate on just the articles appearing in one journal or in journals published by one publisher. But you won't be able to link together the journal articles published by different publishers or in different journals. And this will be an incredible waste. Now, in order to avoid this incredible waste, that there is a broad effort in many disciplines to try and create a common system of tagging, which means in large part a common set of terms, a controlled, structured vocabulary, ideally a controlled, structured, logical vocabulary for tagging scientific literature. Such a controlled, structured, logical vocabulary is, in first approximation, what we can call an ontology. I'll give you an example of how this is happening. This is the journal PLOS Computational Biology. PLOS means Public Library of Science, which means that everything published by PLOS is absolutely freely available on the web. And people are experimenting with using PLOS journal articles as experimental objects for this new kind of tagging to add extra value to linear text in journals. And so this article here has already been tagged, and the tags are marked by various different colors. So this is a journal in infections, an environmental study of infections. And so we have things like diseases, the habitats, institutions involved, the organisms involved, persons, places, proteins, taxon, and so forth. Tagged using HTML tags in the way that you see here. Now, this is hard work, the tagging. It's hard work developing the tagging systems. It's hard work developing the tagging terminologies. And that hard work will in the future be done by some of those people who will be called ontologists. It's not philosophical work, but some of the people who are doing it will have to be trained in the way that we train people studying ontology in philosophy departments today. My prediction is that in the future, large scientific research establishments will have trained ontologists, part of whose job will be to ensure efficient and successful and consistent and correct tagging of all the publications and databases, experimental results, reports produced by the relevant hospital or research lab or whatever it might be. Now, this is, as we shall see later on today, already happening. Now this is just a small example of one way in which ontology is becoming important to the future of science and clinical medicine. It's also becoming important to the future of government administration, military operations. I will talk only a little bit about these other areas, but exactly the same kinds of motives for the importance of ontology are applied, can be recognized in those areas as in the areas of science. Now, of all of these ventures, the most successful is something called the gene ontology. The NIH has already invested something like $100 million in creating the gene ontology and in using it to annotate, that is to say, tag scientific literature in the areas of primarily what is called model organism. Organism biology is the study of non-human organisms like mice or fish or flies in order to draw conclusions about the workings of those organisms, which can help us to understand human beings for the sake of understanding how human beings get sick and how they can be cured. So there are over 1 million annotations which have been tagged, over 11 million annotations which use the gene ontology to relate different areas of scientific data to each other in a logical way, using a controlled vocabulary, which is used by many, many groups studying many, many different kinds of organisms for many, many different kinds of purposes. The fact that they all use the same controlled vocabulary means that all the work that they do is automatically integratable with the work that the other people in this group do. And the use of the Go is growing constantly because of its success in bringing about this integration, which is possible because of sensible, consistent tagging, not just of text, but also of database. So Go is multi-species. It applies not just to humans and mouse and fly, it applies to any organism in principle. It contains just those terms in biology, like death or cell or membrane, which apply whatever kind of organism you're dealing with. It's multidisciplinary. It's been put together not just by model organism biologists, but by people who know something about immunology, by people who know something about development, by people who know something about anatomy, cell structure. So experts in very many different subdisciplines of biology have been involved in compiling and correcting and testing the terminology of the Go. And that means that it's also multigranular, so it contains terms applying to biological phenomena at all levels, from molecular phenomena all the way up to population biology. And it looks like this. So this is a very small fragment of the gene ontology, which contains 30,000 terms, I believe. So one of the categories in the Aristotelian sense in the gene ontology is biological process. It means it's just the topmost node of 3 hierarchies which make up the Go. The black lines here mean subtype, which in the lingo of the gene ontology and of many other ontologies that we will meet is called ISA. So, for instance, this a cellular process is a biological process. A primary metabolic process is a cellular process. The blue lines they stand for part of. So a transcription is part of a gene expression, which is a subtype of macromolecule metabolic process, which is a subtype of metabolic process, and so on. So you can see how it works. This is not rocket science. It's not philosophy either. It's ontology. So, and now there are other ontologies which work with the Go, which were created by the same community of biologists using the same methods in order to provide coverage for other kinds of biological phenomena. And the Go has enabled a kind of virtual science. So what we have here is a kind of virtual map of biological reality in something like the Aristotelian sense. It's Aristotelian universals, which we understand because they are provided with definitions, which are also captured within the gene ontology by biologists who know how the biological world works. Now, this goal of virtual science, where we can understand scientific literature with the aid of computers, we can do logic across scientific literature, is possible only if we can get the data, we can compare the data, we can integrate the data. And again, that's possible only if we're using a common controlled vocabulary. And the role of the Go here is a bit like the role of systems of units in unifying science. The degree that everyone is using a common vocabulary, data becomes comparable. just as to the degree that people always use seconds and meters and kilograms to express their measurement results, means that those measurement results become comparable and integratable. And the use of common systems of units was an incredible boost for the evolution of science. It meant that science became genuinely international for the first time. Now, in order to build these things, we have to engage in something like philosophy. So the Go biological process hierarchy is organized like this. Is this the right way to organize this hierarchy? That's not a biological question. The biologists have done a good job, but it's taken a lot of work, and it has involved some help from people like me in order to solve problems which one could detect in earlier versions of the gene ontology. And then it becomes even more difficult if this top level has to work well with the top levels of other ontologies which have equally difficult problems when you try and address whether this or that particular way of organizing the hierarchy is the best one. And as I say, this brings us back to something which is recognizably the sort of thing that Aristotle was doing. In fact, I would make so bold as to claim, this might sound trivial, but actually it's very bold, that Aristotle was the first ontologist in the non-philosophical sense. So Aristotle invented ontology. All right, so you can see this by looking at what was almost certainly the very first visual representation of an ontological hierarchy by Porphyrius in a commentary on Aristotle. I think this is a Latinate, well, it must be a Latinate rendering, but we have good reason to believe that Porphyrius conceived the kingdom of Aristotelian universals as forming a tree in this way, with substances at the bottom and is that Plato? With substances at the top and Plato at the bottom, and irrational. But it goes on down further down. Irrational animals. So Derrida would be down here, I suppose. And then Linnaeus was also a follower of Aristotle in this sense. The Linnaean hierarchies are explicitly hierarchies built on the basis of Aristotelian tables of categories, which Linnaeus had studied in school. And these hierarchies can be used also computationally. If we associate certain kinds of attributes with certain terms, with certain levels in the hierarchy, we know, for instance, that all animals have skin, and therefore, if we know that all birds are animals, then we also know that birds have skin. But in addition, birds have wings, and if we know, therefore, that a canary is a bird, then we can infer that a canary has wings and has skin. And in this way, these hierarchies can be used as computational aids. We associate attributes which hold generally of given terms higher up, and we can save time because we don't need to repeat those attributes as we go down the list. So this is just the inference that we know that X is a canary, and we therefore know that X is a bird, and therefore we know that X can fly. Now, there is a question. Why are species-genus hierarchies like this good ways to represent the world for purposes of reasoning? And the Aristotelian answer to this question is because that's the way the world is. Canaries really are subspecies of birds, and that's what Aristotle told us to believe. It's not a trivial thesis that there are universals in the world which are organized hierarchically. The gene ontology captures many more of such hierarchical relations which don't apply to species like bird or animal, don't apply to species and other taxons like bird and animal, but rather to other aspects of biological reality. And there are similar ontologies in other domains, in physics and elsewhere, which capture the hierarchical relations between universals in those other domains. And we have not just hierarchical representations of these things, but also we can represent them as maps. So animals form a bigger portion of reality than do birds, and canaries form a smaller sub-portion of reality. And this is a map of reality in something like Wittgenstein's sense. It's a picture of reality. And so we should think of the job of the ontologist as creating pictures of reality in some sort. Ontologies are windows on reality. They help us to understand reality because they tell us what the universals are in reality. And if we know what universals are in reality, we can see the world through the window of the ontology in order to understand it better. That's the idea. And if we all use the same ontologies, then our understanding will be much more powerful because we can share data. The reason why I'm giving all of these pictures of windows is because Kant said basically that there are no windows on reality. That's why Kant was the beginning of the truly dark age in the history of philosophy. And now, but one further element that we need not to forget is the fact that there are not merely these universal hierarchies, there are also instances of universals. So there are actual organisms. And Aristotle's metaphysics actually was built around the central role of organisms in organizing the universal hierarchy as he conceived it. For Aristotle, the most important universals are substance universe. And for him, cow and man really were the good examples. And then rocks and planets, I'm not sure whether he would have counted those as substance universals at all, but we will do so. Substance universals have the nice feature that if you are an instance of a substance universal, then you are always an instance of the very same substance universal. If you are once a cow, you are always a cow. If you are once a human being, you are always a human being. And similarly with a planet. Now, there are also for Aristotle what he called accident universals. Actually, he didn't call them that. He used Greek, but he meant something like that. Accident universals don't pertain to what a thing is, they pertain to how it is. Red or hot or suntanned. Happy, unhappy. And there are also accident instances. So if this is the universal, which is this color here, which is a kind of scarlet, which is a kind of red, which is a kind of color, which is a kind of quality, then there is a token or instance of this universal redness, which is the redness of this blob here. That's an instance. That instance cannot migrate. That redness here cannot be the redness of his pullover. It can be an instance of the same universal, but it can't be the same instance because accidents do not migrate from one universal to another, says Aristotle and says various medieval philosophers. For Aristotle, there were 9 different kinds of accidents. Sorry, 9. Yes, 9. But there are 10 categories. There are different lists, but we will just assume 10 because it's a round number. Including things like quality, place, and so forth. So we have substances. They are the bearers of various different accidents. And then there is a relation of dependence between the accident and the substance. John's hunger cannot exist without John. It depends on John. And if we add all of this together, we get what we might call Aristotle 1.0. There are universals, which are here called types. There are substance universals, there are accident universals, there are substance individuals or instances, and there are accident individuals or instances. And put them all together, you get Aristotle 1.0. Now, that can also be represented as a square called the ontological square. So we have particulars on the level of substance, this man, this cat, this ox, and then we have universals on the level of substance, the universal man, the universal cat, universal ox, and then we have universals, which are accidental universals, and we have particulars, which are accidental particulars. Now, basically, Aristotle 1.0 is as small as you can get when it comes to an ontology. If you try and do your ontology with fewer resources than this, then you'll never succeed. But as a result of the general tendency of reductionism in 20th century philosophy, 20th century philosophy did indeed attempt to get away with even fewer than 4 categories. And this is the category system, or anyway, it's a rough approximation to the category system, which underlies most of 20th century logical philosophy, which tries to get away with just individual things and universal attributes. We will talk about this in lecture number 2, so we don't need to go into details here. Some people don't believe in universals at all. They are nominalists. Sometimes they are bicategorial nominalists in the sense that they believe in substance universals and accident universals, sometimes called ropes. Now we have the first discussion period. John.
I want to congratulate the lecture up to this point, and your point about the ontology.
But can you speak into the microphone?
Yes. Your point about the ontology of modern predicate logic is exactly right, and you are the first person that I have heard say it. This was worth the price of admission. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Anyone else want to ask a question? Good. So then we have here bicategorial nominalism, which just denies universal. And I really can't understand why anybody should believe that they could live in a world like this. But then we have process metaphysics, which says that there are only something like accidents or processes, that they themselves don't exist. This is sometimes called four-dimensionalism, and my response to people who claim to be defenders of process metaphysics is, see a doctor. Now, doctors are not processes. See a doctor. And in fact, however, to do the job properly, we need more than just 4 categories. The 4-category ontology is not enough, because not everything in reality is either a substance or an accident. And the first kind of part of reality that is not a substance or an accident, we need to deal with artifacts also. But at the moment, we're dealing with what makes this particular complex of parts here work as an artifact. And it only works if you can sit in it. And it only allows you to sit in it if it has a place where you can sit in it. And that place is part of reality. But it's not made of anything. So it's not a substance in Aristotle's sense. It's what we might think of as a whole with an H. And a lot of artifacts actually work only if they have holes in them. All buildings, houses, lecture rooms, hospitals have holes in them so that we can go inside them. All places characteristically have holes in them so that people can be in them. And Aristotle doesn't do very well, unfortunately, when it comes to understanding the ontology of wholes. So he does have, maybe John will stand up now and say, I just wrecked everything by it. So Aristotle's doctrine of place is not really very good. For Aristotle, the place of a substance is the interior boundary of the surrounding body. So if I'm a fish swimming in water, then my place is the boundary of the water, which I am, as it were, displacing by being in the water. Now, that doesn't work when you have a whole which is not occupied by any organism, because there is no body which is in a place. Aristotle's theory of place only works if the place is occupied. So we need to extend Aristotle's metaphysics. And if we examine a very simple kind of hole, this is a hole in the ground, We have a solid physical boundary in virtue of which the whole exists in the ground, but we also have the top of the whole, which is also not present anywhere in Aristotle's metaphysics, because it too is not made of matter, but it's not an accident. It's what I would like to call a fiat boundary. So the whole here is bounded from the rest of reality by a fiat boundary, which means just a non-physical boundary. And examples of the physical boundaries are the surface of the planet or the surface of an organism, but fiat boundaries are, for instance, geographic boundaries between postal districts, or they're boundaries of the regions of the brain identified by brain scientists, which don't correspond, all of them, to any kind of physical discontinuities in the underlying cell structures. And of course, mountains have fiat boundaries, but now the fiat boundaries are in the physical structure of the rock. And in fact, geologists represent fiat boundaries of mountains as being much lower down. So mountains are a bit like icebergs for geologists. And but how do we deal with mountains from the Aristotelian point of view? A mountain is not a substance. It's a part of a substance, but it's an interesting kind of part which is separated from the whole by means of a fiat boundary. And we need those parts because without them we are dead, because they include things like lungs and hearts and feet and teeth. And if we don't have those things in our ontology, then we will be in a bad way. Now, Aristotle has them in his writings. He wrote a book called he didn't write. Somebody wrote down notes which became what we now call parts of the animals. But there is no place in Aristotle's metaphysics for the parts of the animals, because Aristotle did not do justice to parts of substances. So these are some brain regions. Wherever you have a straight dotted line here, that means that it's a fiat boundary rather than a boundary which corresponds to any physical discontinuity. So this brings us to Aristotle 1.5. We have substances, accidents, both universals and particulars. We have wholes and other entities not made of matter, which we'll talk about later. We have fiat and bona fide boundaries, and we have artifacts and environments which we haven't talked about yet, except in passing, but which we will talk about later on. Now, many of these things are encountered in our everyday existence, mountains, for instance. And so one question which arises is, how do these kinds of entities, organisms, mountains, relate to those kinds of entities which are studied by science, by which I mean primarily, of course, physics? How do we understand the relations between the macro and the micro reality, which we now know to exist? How do we couple scientific realism with realism about the everyday world? If we're going to do the job of ontology properly, we need to be able to do justice to all kinds of reality, because all kinds of reality are described in scientific texts, for instance. And in order to do this, we need something like Aristotle 2010. And so I've been emailing with Aristotle to find out what this should contain. And just very, very briefly, one issue that we have to face, which we have not yet addressed, is an issue which has to do with Aristotle's philosophy of science. Aristotle was what you might call an observationalist. So he thought that the way to do science was to observe nature and describe what he sees or what he discovers by prodding or poking. And the problem is that you sometimes observe things which don't fit into your category system. So I said earlier that every bird can fly. Canary is a bird, therefore canary can fly. There are some birds that can't fly. Now, Aristotle would have noted that down in his observation list. Ostrich cannot fly. He would not have done anything with the fact that there was a contradiction between his assertion higher up the hierarchy, birds can fly, with his assertion lower down the hierarchy, ostrich is bird and ostrich cannot fly. The difference between Aristotle and modern science is that modern science always has to resolve such contradictions. And so what modern science does is it resolves the contradictions by digging more deeply into areas of reality which are not visible to the normal observational human eye, and discovers things like DNA molecules. And what we learn is that this portion of reality here can be partitioned at different levels of granularity, including partitioned at the molecular level. And when we partition reality at the molecular level, we understand how it is that an ostrich can be a bird and yet not fly, because the DNA of ostrich is different from the DNA of, for instance, canaries in flying relevant ways, which we can now understand. In fact, there are more levels than just this. So an organism is a totality of atoms at the physical atomic level. It's a totality of molecules at the chemical level. It's a totality of cells at the cell biological level. It's an organism at the organism biological level. And we can picture this reality veridically at every one of these levels. Science is a multi-leveled enterprise. And one of the levels which is consistent with the scientific levels is the level of what we call everyday reality. There are multiple transparent partitions of reality at different levels of granularity. And the job of the gene ontology and of the other ontologies that we'll be meeting is to capture those transparent partitions of reality. Now, of course, not every partition of reality is capturing anything which is scientifically interesting or valid. Now, Aristotle might have said that every partition of reality, and Aristotle probably thought there was only one partition. Aristotle probably did not really grasp the importance of these multiple levels. But he certainly thought that partitions of reality should be structured in the substance-accident form. They should be consistent with his theory of categories. It could be, for instance, that there are pure process levels. It could be that there are levels of reality, quantum levels or some other levels, where reality is not structured in terms of these substantial clumps like cells or organisms, but rather is a kind of continuum of field-like variation. Nothing that I'm going to say today is designed to be complete. But what I am going to say today is that the general Aristotelian approach, based upon the idea that there are substances that endure through time, continue to exist, and accidents and various other kinds of dependent entities, which some of which endure through time, like colors, and some of which occur in time, like spinnings or swimmings, that these things exist and that there have to be scientific partitions of these things which can be captured in ontological form if we are to do the business of science properly. And I think there are many of them. I don't think there is any one unique correct ontology. I think that there are multiple correct ontologies, which means that I embrace a doctrine of perspectivalism. The official name for my doctrine is extreme mereological Aristotelian perspectivalism, or EMAP. But perspectivalism just says that there are different cuts through reality which science will need in order to do its job properly. And that these cuts can sometimes be skewed to each other in just the same way that you can cut a piece of cheese either this way or that way. And both cuts are perfectly possible ways of cutting the same piece of cheese. This is one cut. It's a very useful cut. This is probably one of the best ontologies we will ever have. And this is an ontology of chemical elements. This is another one. It's an ontology of biological processes, or a fragment thereof. It's not nearly as good as this, but that's because the domain of biological processes is much messier than this. Now, both of these are partitions of reality which are transparent to the hierarchical order of the underlying reality. The two capture reality at different levels of granularity, so that, for instance, cellular constituents are visible to the Go window on reality, but the elements captured in the periodic table are invisible to the Go window. So different windows in different portions or dimensions or layers of reality. That's perspectivalism. And now we can go back to the ostrich. So this, I used to do this, and I forgot to get rid of all the animations, so I apologize. So we have the ostrich. The ostrich can't fly. The ostrich is a bird. The bird can fly. We can understand why that is now because we understand about the DNA of ostrich. But now there's a bigger problem, which is illustrated by this smaller problem for the entire Aristotelian approach. But the Aristotelian approach is based on clumping. There are substances in physical reality. For instance, organisms. Organisms are clumps. I am an organism, you are an organism. Organisms are separated from each other. Very, very rarely, in the case of Siamese twins, are organisms not separated in a clear way. The problem is that in the realm of accident, we are often not dealing with clumps. Language makes us clump the realm of accidents by talking about the color red, the color yellow, the color green, and so forth. But of course, the color continuum is a continuum. There are no clumps. And so one of the problems that we need to address, which is sort of captured by the ostrich case, well, we have can fly, can't fly, we have the kingdom of birds, we have a fuzzy area where the can fly, can't fly dichotomy can't quite properly be applied. Here we have a fuzzy area everywhere. Now, ontology is going to have to deal with those fuzzy areas somehow. And the problem is that when we try and do ontology in such a way that we can use ontologies inside computer systems, then we have a tendency to deny the fuzzy areas. Because just as language has a tendency to clump, so computational systems have a tendency to clump. Databases like to have entries, and each entry is a data atom, which is a clump compared to all its other data atoms. And these data atoms are organized sometimes hierarchically. For instance, in the file system on your hard drive, but eventually we always get down to single clumps. And if we look at something like the database of books in the Library of Congress, which is organized on the basis of the Dewey Decimal Classification, and we have a very, very large systematic clumping of all of the published literature collected in the Library of Congress into categories, some of which look rather old-fashioned now, because when the Dewey Decimal Classification was designed, many things like hard drives didn't exist. But this Dewey Decimal Classification forces a clumping classification on all literature, even when books very often don't fall exactly under one classification or another. Now, this is fine as far as it goes. So, within the Dewey Decimal Classification, everything works well because there are no borderline cases, because everything has exactly one number. So we have a crisp classification because we created the classification so that books are classified according to their numbers. And since each book is given only one number, there are no problems about borderline cases where one book should really be in both of two classifications. We yield a classification that is crisp, but the realm of literature is not crisp. There are all kinds of fuzzy areas. Databases crisp the world. Their databases operate on the basis of what is called a closed world assumption. And this closed world assumption operates because the database reality, which is represented by the database, is created by the database. Now, I'm not saying that this is bad. This is just an inevitable effect of the way database technology works. But I am saying that it smacks of cant. Kant said we can never know what reality is like in itself. We can only know what the reality that we create through our experiences is like. In the database world, we can never have a database which represents reality. We can only ever have a database which represents what the database is enabled to represent on the basis of the categories that it chooses and on the basis of the mechanism that it chooses to create crisp binning of objects under these categories. The databases operate with a closed world assumption. What they do in order to capture a continuum is to turn it into a digitalized, demarcated order. So each of the ontologies produced by databases deal not with reality, but with objects which are constructed by the database itself. I'll give you an example. If you have a hospital database, very often it will catalog patients according to whether they are male or female. Every patient has to be classified as either one or the other. Even patients who don't know what their gender is or have some kind of other gender have to be classified as male and female. That's because the world of the database only has those two options. Now, a good scientific ontology cannot be constructed like a database. This is a picture of Kant. Because flesh and blood reality is marked by this problem of fuzziness, or that very many features of flesh and blood reality are marked as continua rather than as clumps. So how can we create adequate representation in a world which contains continua, in a world where some attributions of properties are going to involve vagueness? Another example is baldness. Some people are bald. You can put those under the bald heading. Some people are not bald. I think I can honestly claim to be a not bald person. But where do we put those people who are not yet quite bald? Now, if you're an Aristotelian, if you're a database person, you don't have any problems. You pick a number. But if you're an Aristotelian, then there is a real problem here, because we want to have nice hierarchies, and it's not clear what the hierarchy should be in the case of continuum categories like baldness. Now, Kantianism works well where we are dealing with non-continuum categories, like books. I sometimes call this Midas touch epistemology. So you create the category system of the Library of Congress not by seeing what reality is like, but by imposing it in the numbering system on the reality. So the categories are created by the database engineer. But for Aristotle, reality in itself is accepted as being messy, and we have somehow to find a way of making our categories fit that reality rather than a perfectly constituted hierarchical reality which we ourselves create through building a database. How do we do this? Well, the answer is that for Aristotle, this is very often a charge made against Aristotle that he thought that everything was clump. But in fact, Aristotle was perfectly clear that reality, particularly biological reality, is such that there are always borderline cases. So Aristotle recognized that there is a difference between standard or prototypical instances of universals and non-standard or fringe instances. The person with 6 fingers or the ostrich that can't fly are fringe instances. They're non-prototypical, non-canonical. We can still apply categories like bird and person, but we apply those categories knowing full well that not all of the attributes associated with those categories will apply in every instance because they're a fringe instance. So natural categories for the Aristotelian have borderline cases. There is a penumbra of borderline cases surrounding a kernel of focal instances, and of course there is a vague area between the two because there are many instances which we can't classify as borderline or as fringe, or as focal because they are in process of changing from one to the other, perhaps. So, what happens when we identify a fringe instance is we try and find a finer-grained partition which will enable us to understand the fringe instance. And then the advance of science can be understood in precisely these terms. The advance of science is not away from Aristotle towards something which would demolish Aristotle's achievement, as people sometimes believe. Rather, the advance of science is a rigorous demonstration of the correctness of Aristotle's approach. We can identify the fringe instances only because we have a category system which can distinguish between categories at different levels and recognize that at certain levels we get instances which don't fall prototypically under the relevant category or universal, and then we can be forced to identify further attributes at lower levels of granularity which will explain those differences. Now, for Kant and the database engineer, each partition of reality gives only a partial view, and thus a distorted view. And that means that we can never, they don't give us a way of knowing reality, but rather a way of distorting reality. And therefore we end up with a philosophy of suspicion. We only know what we ourselves have constructed. But for Aristotelianism, there are two sorts of partitions. There are true, Aristotle 2010, those which relate merely to created surrogate worlds, like the Library of Congress catalog, or the system of categories created by the U.S. taxation code, and then those which are transparent to some independent reality beyond, like the gene ontology. Now, I'm going to conclude now. This is the penultimate slide of the morning session. We're doing quite well. But very often in the world of ontology, people use the word concept. I never used the word concept. I didn't use it then. I mentioned it. On the Kantian reading, we really only ever have concepts in our heads. And whether they have to do with anything out there is for Kant, impossible to say, but almost certainly they do not. We bring our concepts into being, as it were. I'm criminally simplifying both Kant and Aristotle, but I'm right nonetheless. On the Aristotelian reading, the world itself out there is organized into hierarchies of universes, including very complicated hierarchies in domains like artifacts or digital artifacts. And some of these hierarchical orders are very difficult to understand. But we can understand them, and when we understand them, then we see the world. We don't create some concepts and see our own concepts. We see the world. We have a map of the world. And ontology is just one kind of map of the structure of reality. And the ontologies that we will be talking about henceforth will be based upon this very, very simple top level, which distinguishes continuants, which are what Aristotle used to call substances, roughly speaking, and occurrence, which are just another name for events and processes. Accidents go here, instances go here, and we will see more about how this works in the rest of the next day and a half. So now we have 15 minutes or so for questions. So you should just go to the microphone and speak as clearly as you can into the microphone.
I was curious about with the chronological wave and the Aristotle going to the practical to the skepticism. I mean, I'm not a philosopher, so maybe you could just clear up the difference between sort of Aristotelian scientific curiosity and skepticism, and how the skepticism sort of falls away from this fifth phase with the ontology.
Good. So Aristotle was born in an age when discoveries were being made, and making discoveries was the normal thing, as it were. So, and Aristotle was very interested in making discoveries. So he liked exploring ponds and so forth and discovering new kinds of organism. And he liked dissecting organisms and trying to see what was going on inside them and so forth. Now, in such an age, people accept the fact that we can know what reality is like. It's amazing. All this reality, let's try and understand it. Seems to be a sensible thing to do. Then eventually you reach an age, or you reach a point where you seem to know what there is to know. And it becomes systematized, and it becomes part of the background presuppositions of your fellow human beings. And it becomes boring because everyone knows it. Of course, there are organisms. And then there are tables, mothers and fish and shoes. And I could go on like this for hours and hours and hours. And no one is interested anymore. And David Hume has a passage somewhere in which he explains why the Irish always tell lies. And the reason is that in Ireland, all you have is, Ireland isn't, I'm talking about Ireland as it used to be in the good old days, all you have is farming. And that means all you know is the weather. And if you tell the truth, then it's raining. And who would tell the truth? So when you reach this point where the knowledge has been systematized and has been bred into the entire folk, people start saying things like, does the world really exist? Or is the world really flat? And then they become skeptical. They will start to wonder, do we really know everything? And then that unsettles the solidified edifice. And then people start to think, can we ever really know anything? Maybe we are perpetually doomed to be the victims of some gigantic epistemological plot called Western civilization or modern physics. And then you get Paris.
It would then be a quantitative amount of skepticism, or is it a sort of skepticism? I guess I'm.
So if you look
at simple, just say it's simple. Do some research. I can.
If you look at the history of philosophy, there are counterexamples to the phases that Brentano described and to the extensions. So there are skeptics also in the ages of scientific discovery, and there are scientific discoveries also in the ages of skepticism. But still, you can see dominant trends. The Renaissance was an age when people were rediscovering Aristotle and reality at the same time. And that was a golden age in many respects. So there are some patterns here which it's worth pursuing. And certainly the idea of a cycle that I just described is it's a coherent idea which you can identify in general terms.
Mary, again, I have to congratulate you. It was a wonderful present.
Oh, you're disappointing me, John. I thought you'd be full of criticism.
I soften you up for my errors. In the first place, I think that with the substance accident picture that you gave for Aristotle, you really should have made room for relations. And the same thing with your little picture of first-order logic with the individuals and the accidents. Relations play a big part in there. And in the ontology, relations are much more important than you've given any space for them.
I'm willing to accept that, and I think you will be satisfied after you've heard the next lecture, at least with regard to relations on the side of the logician. So there I do try and do justice to relations. But I agree with you that I did not, and I'm sad to say that I will not do justice to Aristotle's treatment of relations in what follows. But I agree with you. So there's no...
the other thing about interpreting birds can fly as every bird can fly is very un-Aristotelian. Aristotle recognized a category of indefinite propositions that were neither as strong as universal nor as weak as singular existential. And you just ignored that in order to throw a little barb at Aristotle and say there's a contradiction between birds can fly and ostriches can't fly. Aristotle makes a big deal in many places about things that are true for the most part, and of one of the sins that he was always guarding against was not being more precise than the subject matter allowed. So, although it was probably rhetoric on your part too.
I never use rhetoric.
Well, I wanted to clear that up.
So can I just to try and set the record straight, because I'm on your side in this respect too. There are people who use these ontological hierarchies in order to create universal reasoning systems. And those people have a problem because there is indeed a genuine contradiction between an assertion that the form birds can fly higher in the hierarchy and then an assertion lower down that this particular bird cannot fly. They have the problem. I agree with you that Aristotle didn't have the problem. I tried to formulate that by saying that for the Aristotelian, we are perfectly aware that many universals are such that they have borderline cases where not all the attributes apply. You are quite right to point out that Aristotle had a worked out theory of different kinds of modalized propositions. Do justice to that. So I wasn't trying to bash Aristotle. I was trying to bash people who use hierarchies to create oversimplified inferences.
I had one little, actually I have 2 points. The next point I'm making, I think, is probably the most important point that I'm going to make maybe for the next few days. And that is, the modern logic books encourage people to say, instead of every man is an animal, every X is such that if X is a man, then X is an animal, and then they take is a man and is an animal to be predicates.
Yep, and they make a mistake.
They are desubstantivizing.
You'll like the next lecture.
But now the point is that students that say for every X are in the first place speaking bad English. After every, you have to have a common noun.
Yep.
One of the first steps, as George Orwell points out, of controlling people is to get them to stop speaking normal English. And this is a little conspiracy going. You should be...
But I too want to control people by roughly that methodology. It's just that I want them to speak a correctly regimented scientific English.
But it has to be English.
I agree, absolutely.
It has to be taking the best parts of English and working that into a system. Now, of the people that rediscovered Aristotle and want to show that Aristotle was on the right path, Paul was one of the greats.
I see.
Bull's aim was not to correct Aristotle, but to take what was correct in Aristotle and extend it and refine it. He was by no means an anti-Aristotelian. And you're one of it. Oh, and my rediscovery of Aristotle's natural deduction system was another pro-Aristotelian author.
If I was still a philosopher, I would be writing articles about how Bull rediscovered Aristotle. All right, I think that we will stop there. We'll have 15 minutes coffee break, and then we'll start with lecture number 2. So thank you very much.